Okay, this is the first part of the PowerPoint presentation for Urban Sociology, West Virginia State University. This is our pickup point. We were in class Thursday talking about the development of North American cities, and we had just finished talking about Thomas Malthus and some of the flaws with his theories and theories of people like him. So what we're going to do in the next, probably this will take 2 or 3 different video sessions of about 10 minutes apiece, give or take. We're going to finish up the history stuff, and then as promised, we're going to start moving into some more contemporary kinds of issues. So my suggestion is you should go to the web for this class. I have attached, by the time you're watching this, I will have attached the note-taking shell for the next one that we're going to be looking at. This is just a couple slides, then we're going to move into the next PowerPoint presentation. And so I would go to the web, print off or have accessible the note-taking template or shell, and that'll help you with your note-taking. So also be on the lookout. Probably I'll be sending some videos and some other things for you to watch as well. So anyway, now we talk about population implosion. This is another flaw in some of the early Malthusian theories about population growth and the consequences of population growth and explosion. With population implosion, we see the end of population explosion and its subsequent rapid downsizing. And we're starting to see, like we talked about in more developed parts of the world, we see this especially in cities in more developed parts of the world, that population numbers, yes, they are growing still in terms of pure numbers, but that rate of growth is slowing down, starting to level off in some countries. And we're starting to see some population projections that are showing that some places, countries, areas will be smaller in 25 years, in 50 years than they are today. Fertility rates are expected to stay low from 2000 to 2050 in more developed countries. Populations of 30 developed countries are expected to be smaller by 2050. For example, it is projected that Japan will be 14% smaller by 2050. Italy will be 22% smaller by 2050. Bulgaria, Estonia, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, anywhere from 30 to 50% smaller by the year 2050. And then we have the British scientist Charles Darwin. Now, I mentioned in class the idea of social Darwinism and the idea that people like Herbert Spencer, who we'll talk about in a minute, took Darwin's ideas and applied them to human beings. Now, Darwin was a natural scientist, and you've probably talked about Darwin in other classes. I'm sure you have. His idea of natural selection, the idea that those traits that are most suitable and make the organism more adaptable to the environment are going to be passed on. That's going to ensure a stronger offspring and a more adaptable offspring. Makes sense with plants and with animals. And also the idea of survival of the fittest. The idea that the most fit amongst a species or a group will survive. Again, Darwin's talking about plants, animals, not really human beings, but the ideas start to become applied to human beings. Herbert Spencer was an English sociologist, was a philosopher. We also claim him as, some circles of sociology actually claim him as one of the founding fathers of sociology. Brilliant man, had a lot of really interesting ideas, but was also taking Darwin's ideas and applying them to society and suggesting that we should not help those, again, who are at the proverbial bottom of the ladder. He, again, expanded the ideas of Darwin. We hear the term social Darwinism thrown around all the time, and we're going to talk more in the next PowerPoint presentation about social Darwinism and really the eugenics movement that I sort of foreshadowed in our class on Thursday. And again, the idea of survival of the fittest as applied to human beings. You have people like Spencer now and others like him who are saying, yes, we're having all this population explosion in cities. Now, in our country, again, during this time, we're seeing immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe. We're seeing population growth to explosion, and we're worried, again, that you have too many people and not enough resources. So what are we going to do? Well, certain people are going to die off because you've got too many people and not enough resources. So why not encourage or adopt a philosophy that reflects that the weakest among us should be the ones that die off? So that's kind of what we were talking about a little bit on Thursday. We're going to talk more about that and the implications of that. Now, Social Darwinism, as we're going to see, is today generally regarded to as a misapplication of Darwin's theory to society. A mistake, if you will. It was used to justify racism, sexism, imperialism, ethnocentric attitudes. Ethnocentric means that you simply view other cultures through your own cultural lens. And we did that in this country. We looked at people from other countries, especially during the Great Immigration from 1880 to 1910, when we had all these people coming from Europe who didn't speak our language, who weren't immediately assimilating into our mainstream culture as being inferior because they weren't like us. So we see social Darwinism that was used to justify the positions of those at the top, largely white people, like we talked about in class on Thursday. So that pretty much ends that part. Now, I was hoping to have gotten through all this on Thursday, but that's okay. We didn't, and that's okay. So, but let me get rid of this, and we'll get the next one up. I've got it ready for you. Should have it ready. Here we go. So, now, this is the one that you'll be printing off at this point. Chapter 5. Again, this is the last part of the history stuff that we're really going to do, and then we're going to really change up, and we're going to move into some more contemporary issues. So, again, we're still in Chapter 5, and we're talking now about the era of the great metropolis. So we're moving into a different era. You have your PowerPoint shell printed off for this at this point, I hope. You'll see that you have some spots that you kind of need to fill in as we go through the video. Obviously, you can play the video as much as you want. If you miss something, you can kind of go back. You can stop and start. With some factual information here, both technological advances and urban migration provided the fuel for the smaller cities to grow into these big urban places, these big urban centers during this era. We start to see the construction of high-rise buildings. We're starting to see for the first time building up, like we talked about, instead of building out. We're not increasing the physical space of cities. So in other words, to accommodate growing numbers of people within the same space, physical space, we have to start building up to do that. So we see that. We see the construction of steam-powered trains, the construction of electric trolleys, and all of these contribute to the outward expansion of the city as well into suburbs. So we do have the building up, but there still is a process of sort of building or expanding outward as well. And we'll talk about that as we go. During this time, the following contributed greatly to the growing labor force for our growing industrial economy. Rural to urban migration, so people essentially are moving from the countryside to the city. And also international migration. I've mentioned the Great Immigration, which technically was from 1880 to 1910. That 30-year time frame is sort of characterized as the Great Immigration, but it falls within this era of the Great Metropolis. So that's why we're seeing cities grow in terms of numbers. They're moving from the countryside, and they're coming from other countries, and they're largely landing in cities. I don't have a command of the specific statistics, but I'm pretty certain that during this time, something like 95%, which is still pretty close to true today, 95% of international immigrants land in or end up right off the bat in cities, not in rural places, but in cities in this country. So we see this massive immigration into the city, and we're talking about cultural heterogeneity. If something is heterogeneous, hetero means different. So we're seeing different cultures. We're seeing a lot of diversity, if you will. People from different parts of the world congregating in the cities, and that's why you see, if you travel to cities today, you see the influence of the entire world. People, cultures, customs from all over the world. Some profited greatly from massive city growth, while others suffered from poor housing and serious health hazards. We mentioned the Industrial Revolution in class on Thursday, when cities were becoming prominent. People were moving from the agricultural based economy, that idea of working on the farm, to an industrial based economy. Factories pop up, and you have really horrible conditions for a lot of people. Poor housing for people, serious health concerns. By 1920, half of the U.S. population resided in cities. That's kind of important to know. So by 1920, for the first time ever, half of the U.S. population is living in cities. People began to question the ability of our country to absorb this constant flow of immigrants into our cities, which prompted a series of restrictive immigration laws and policies that began in the early 1900s. So at the end of the Great Immigration, we start to see our government enact a series of very restrictive immigration policies to sort of stem the tide, if you will, of immigration into this country. A few more slides here, and we'll call it the end of this first part here. The expansion of railroads in the late 1800s resulted in population growth in cities westward. We mentioned Thursday that the railway was a big deal, and people in areas who anticipated that the railway would come through their region would do almost anything to make sure that would happen. They would bribe the railroad companies, pay them money to come through their area so they could profit economically. Omaha, Nebraska, Minneapolis, Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota, experienced a twofold increase in population in the 1800s. Other cities experiencing close to this growth were Kansas City, Missouri, Portland, Oregon, and Denver, Colorado. Even smaller urban places experienced much stronger growth due to the railway, including Seattle, Washington, Los Angeles, California. Due to the opening of railway links, cities in the South experienced a renewal of growth during this time, including Atlanta, Georgia, and Nashville, Tennessee. Urban developers worked very hard to secure federal grants and investments to ensure that the railroads were built through their area. So it wasn't always just bribing, but there were legitimate means that were utilized to make sure that the railway would come through their area. And we talked about the Great Immigration. Over 1 million immigrants every single year from 1880 to 1910 into our country. It may not sound like a lot, but again, during this time there were a lot less people in our country than there are now. So these numbers were staggering. The economic depression of the 1880s in the U.S. slowed the urban growth rate from 56.5% in the 1880s to 36.4% in the 1890s. So again, we see this slowing down of rate in terms of rate of growth. However, the pure numbers are still going up. It's just that the rate has slowed down. But we have a new surge of urban growth that would unfold in the first decade of the 20th century in the U.S. In the first decade of the 20th century in the U.S., 12 million urbanites were added to the U.S. population. 50 different cities now have 100,000 or more people. 8 cities exceed 500,000 people each. So again, we're seeing a major shift in population. America first exceeded 100 million people between 1910 and 1919. In spite of the First World War, other gains in population growth occurred in cities in the U.S. So population growth is still phenomenal, and this is in spite of a world war where we're losing people. During the early 1900s, cities comprised roughly 1/2 of our nation's population. Growth of cities in the U.S. was reflected by the number of people employed by industry and trade. The proportion of industrial to agricultural workers in the U.S. quadrupled in the early 1900s. So again, reflecting that major shift from working on farms to working and living in cities. And we're going to go ahead and call that the end of this part. Thank you very much.